For months, Nurse Emily cared for the unconscious billionaire, bathing him, talking to him, believing he would never wake up. But the day he finally opened his eyes, he looked straight at her and said something that left the entire hospital stunned. The steady beep-beep of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room. Emily sighed as she carefully adjusted the warm washcloth in her hand. Routine. That's what this was. She had done it every day for 6 months. She dipped the cloth into the warm basin and gently ran it over the patient's arm, wiping away the invisible dust of time. "Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, her voice soft as she worked. "You're looking much better today." Of course, he didn't respond. He never did. Ethan Blackwood, billionaire, real estate mogul, one of the most powerful men in the country, had been in a coma for over 6 months. A tragic accident had left him with a severe head injury, and doctors had little hope for his recovery. Emily, however, never gave up on him. She wasn't just his nurse. She was his connection to the world he had left behind. Every day she spoke to him, told him about the weather, the latest hospital gossip, the books she read at night. "Today's a beautiful day," she said, wiping his chest gently. "Sunny, not a cloud in the sky. You'd like it." She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because deep down she believed he could hear her. She rinsed the cloth and moved to his face, running it carefully over his sharp jawline. His features were still strong despite the months of stillness, like a man only sleeping, not lost. "Everyone thinks you won't wake up," she whispered, wringing out the cloth. "But I think you will." She leaned in slightly, her voice softer. "I think you're just waiting for the right moment." And then it happened. A sharp intake of breath. Emily froze. The cloth slipped from her fingers, splashing into the basin. She looked up, and her heart nearly stopped. Ethan Blackwood's eyes were open, and he was staring directly at her. His lips parted, his voice weak but clear. "You're the angel who saved me." Emily's breath hitched, because he shouldn't have been awake, but he was. And somehow, impossibly, he knew her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "You're the angel who saved me." Ethan Blackwood's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. But it was real. After 6 months of silence, of an unresponsive, lifeless state, he was speaking. Emily stared, her mind struggling to catch up. "Mr. Blackwood?" His eyes didn't move from hers. Those deep, piercing green eyes that had been closed for half a year were now locked onto her, like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. His breathing was labored, his body weak. He shouldn't have been able to move. But his fingers twitched. Emily's training kicked in. She needed to call a doctor. She needed to check his vitals. She needed to do something. But she couldn't move. Because Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire in a coma, the man doctors had given up on, was looking at her like he had been waiting for this exact moment. His lips parted again. "I heard you," he rasped. "Every day." Emily's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she instinctively reached for his wrist, checking his pulse. "You heard me." Ethan blinked slowly, exhaustion tugging at his features, but his gaze remained steady. "You kept me here," he murmured. "I wanted to leave. I almost did." His voice was strained, but his next words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "But your voice." His fingers twitched again, as if trying to reach for her. "It pulled me back." Emily swallowed hard, her chest aching. He had been trapped in his own body, unable to move, unable to speak. But he had heard her. Every story, every joke, every whispered encouragement. And somehow, those words had kept him alive. Tears stung her eyes. I don't know what to say." Ethan's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Just don't stop talking." A sharp knock at the door made Emily jump. The spell was broken. Doctors rushed in, gasping when they saw Ethan awake. Machines beeped, voices filled the room, and suddenly, the moment between them was gone. Emily stepped back, watching as the medical team swarmed him. But just before they blocked her view, Ethan's eyes found hers one last time, and in them she saw something that terrified her. Because this wasn't just gratitude, this was something deeper, something neither of them were ready for. The hospital room turned into pure chaos. Doctors swarmed Ethan's bed, nurses checked his vitals, machines beeped wildly as if they, too, were waking up from a deep slumber. Emily took a step back, her heart still racing. "I heard you. You kept me here." The words echoed in her mind as she watched from the edge of the room, feeling completely out of place. For months it had just been her and him. Now she was nothing more than an observer, pushed aside as if the last 6 months had never happened. His heart rate is stabilizing. BP is low but improving. Brain function seems fully intact. This is unbelievable. Dr. Morgan, the lead physician, turned to Ethan with utter disbelief. "Mr. Blackwood, can you tell me your full name?" Ethan's gaze flickered to Emily before answering. "Ethan James Blackwood. And the last thing you remember before the accident?" Ethan's brows furrowed. He exhaled slowly, as if pulling the memory from a fog. "The highway," he murmured. "It was raining. I was driving too fast." He paused, something flickering in his eyes. Then, nothing. Emily clenched her fists. She knew the rest of that story. The accident had nearly killed him. His car flipped 3 times on the freeway. The doctors had barely managed to save him, but they had been certain his brain activity was too weak for recovery. They had all given up, except her. "Your recovery is extraordinary." "Doctor," Morgan admitted. "We'll need to run tests, but Mr. Blackwood, you are truly a medical miracle." Ethan's lips curled slightly, but his eyes never left Emily. "It wasn't a miracle," he said softly. "It was her." The entire room fell silent. Emily's breath hitched. What? Dr. Morgan frowned. "Mr. Blackwood, you've just woken up. You may be experiencing confusion or—" Ethan shook his head. "I know what I'm saying." He turned his full attention to Emily, his voice firm despite the weakness in his body. "I heard everything," he said. "Every story, every word of encouragement, every time you told me not to give up." Emily swallowed hard. "I was trapped in the dark," Ethan continued, his voice filled with something raw. "And then, one day, I heard you. Your voice was the only thing that kept me from slipping away." Emily's chest tightened. Dr. Morgan cleared his throat. "Well, that's fascinating. We've heard of coma patients having vague recollections, but this level of awareness is—" Ethan cut him off. It wasn't vague. It was real. His green eyes bore into Emily's. "I'm alive because of you." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was just his nurse. Nothing more. But the way Ethan was looking at her, as if she was everything. Before she could process it, a woman's voice interrupted the moment. "Ethan!" The door swung open, and a stunning brunette in a designer dress rushed in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Emily immediately recognized her. Madeline Pierce, Ethan Blackwood's fiancée. Emily froze. She had spent months by his side, believing no one was waiting for him. But now, the world Ethan had left behind was rushing back in. And Emily? She suddenly felt very, very small. Emily felt a sharp pang in her chest as Madeline Pierce rushed to Ethan's bedside, tears streaming down her flawless face. "Oh my God, Ethan!" she cried, grabbing his hand. "I thought I lost you." Ethan blinked, his expression shifting. For the first time since waking up, he looked confused. His grip around Madeline's fingers was loose, almost hesitant. His eyes darted to Emily for a brief second before returning to the woman at his bedside. "Madeline," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. Madeline let out a watery laugh. "You remember me. They told me you might have memory loss, but I knew you wouldn't forget." She kissed his hand, clinging to him like she was staking a claim. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and took a step back. This wasn't her place. She wasn't his family. She wasn't his fiancée. She was just a nurse who had done her job. Then why did it feel like she was being ripped away from something that was never hers to begin with? Dr. Morgan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Mr. Blackwood will need to undergo some neurological tests, but for now it's best to let him rest." Madeline nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll stay by his side." Emily turned on her heel, forcing herself to leave. But just as she reached the door, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Wait." She froze. The room fell silent. Emily turned back, heart pounding as Ethan stared at her. His expression wasn't hesitant anymore. It was certain. "She stays," Ethan said firmly. Madeline's brows furrowed. "Who?" Ethan's gaze didn't leave Emily. Emily, she stays!" Emily's breath hitched. Madeline let out a nervous laugh, clearly thrown off. "Ethan, sweetheart, I'm here now. You don't need—" "I do," Ethan interrupted, his voice steady. "I need her here." Emily's chest tightened painfully. Madeline's smile faltered. "Why?" Ethan inhaled deeply, still weak, but his next words sent shockwaves through the entire room. "Because she's the reason I came back." Madeline's face fell. Dr. Morgan looked stunned. "Emily?" She had no words, because the way Ethan was looking at her felt like something more than gratitude. It felt like fate. The air in the hospital room turned thick with tension. Madeline's fingers slowly slipped from Ethan's hand, her expression shifting from shock to something darker. "The reason you came back," she repeated, her voice tight. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" Ethan exhaled, running a weak hand over his face. He was still exhausted, his body barely catching up with his mind, but his gaze never wavered from Emily. "I told you," he said quietly. "I heard her." Emily's heart pounded. Ethan turned toward Madeline, his expression unreadable. "For 6 months I was trapped in the dark. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know if I would wake up. But then," he swallowed, "I heard Emily's voice." Madeline's lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan continued, his tone firm despite his weakness. "She talked to me, every day, told me stories, read me books, made me feel alive." Emily's breath hitched. She had never expected this. Never expected him to remember, to feel, to say these things out loud. "Ethan," Madeline said, forcing a smile. "That's sweet, but she's just your nurse." Ethan tensed. "No," he said, his voice sharper now. "She's the reason I'm here. She's the reason I didn't slip away." Madeline's face darkened. "I'm your fiancé," she snapped. "I was the one waiting for you to wake up. I should be the one you need." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then where were you, Madeline?" Silence. Madeline stiffened. "What?" Ethan inhaled deeply. "For 6 months, where were you? Because I know exactly who was here." Madeline's mouth opened and closed. Her eyes darted to Emily, filled with something ugly. Emily's chest ached. She didn't want this. She never wanted to be in the middle of this. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Blackwood, I should go—" "No." Ethan's voice was stronger now, more certain. "Stay," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Please." Emily's heart twisted. This wasn't just gratitude. This was something deeper. Madeline stepped back. The realization hit her like a slap. "You're choosing her," she whispered, shaking her head. After everything we've been through, you're choosing a nurse. Ethan's expression didn't waver. I'm choosing the person who saved me, he said simply. Madeline let out a bitter laugh, her eyes burning. Unbelievable! Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. Emily stood there, frozen. Ethan took a shaky breath and reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. She should pull away. She should step back and pretend none of this was happening. But she didn't. Because deep down, in a place she never let herself acknowledge before, she knew. This wasn't just a patient. This wasn't just a billionaire. This was Ethan. And somehow, against all odds, they had found each other.